Ferdinand Magellan embarked on a seemingly impossible expedition that launched the very first journey around the entire world. His name is forever written on the maps of the world, but he himself never saw his greatest triumph. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese nobleman in the service of the King of Spain, a man whose obsession with an almost crazy idea started the first journey around the world in human history. This is a story about an expedition into the completely unknown, about how 5 old and battered ships set sail in search of a mythical strait at the end of the world to find a western route to the fabulously wealthy Spice Islands. It will tell what drove a proud Portuguese man to side with his country's greatest enemy and how he managed to convince a young king to invest a fortune in an adventure that the brightest minds of the time considered suicide. It is a tale about hunger, when men ate rats and leather straps just to survive, about mutinies and betrayals, when his own countrymen rebelled in the frozen deserts of Patagonia, about meeting people never seen before, and about the death of the great admiral in a senseless skirmish on a distant island in the Philippines. And finally, about the incredible strength of spirit of those few who aboard the only heavily damaged ship, Victoria, managed to return home, closing the circle and proving that our world is one and can be circumnavigated. A journey to the age of great discoveries, to a world where maps were blank canvases and beyond the horizon awaited untold treasures or certain death. Ferdinand Magellan was born around 1480 in the mountainous northern region of Portugal, in a small village in the province of Trás-os-Montes. It was a land of tough and proud people, a land of granite rocks, vineyards, and olive groves. His family belonged to the minor nobility, the Hidalgos. It was a lineage with an ancient and documented history, but without significant wealth or real influence in the royal court. His father, Rodrigo de Magellan, held the position of mayor, a kind of judge and highest local authority. This meant that the family enjoyed respect, but their life was far from the luxury of the aristocracy in the capital. For a young man from such a family at that time, there were only a few predictable paths to success: a brilliant military career, service in the church, or what was becoming increasingly attractive in that turbulent era, participating in risky but promising overseas expeditions that offered glory and wealth. When Ferdinand turned about 12 years old, thanks to distant family ties, he was sent to serve in Lisbon, as was customary for the sons of noble families. He became a page in the court of Queen Eleanor of Viseu, widow of King John II. It was a gigantic leap. From the quiet and traditional province, he was immersed in the center of the world, right in the epicenter of the age of great discoveries. Lisbon, at the end of the 15th century, was not just the capital of Portugal. It was the most dynamic, cosmopolitan, and wealthy city in Europe. Its port looked like a dense forest of masts, from hundreds of ships arriving from all corners of the world. In the markets, the air was thick and spicy with smells that the rest of Europe did not know. The piercing smell of black pepper, the sweet aroma of cinnamon, the musky scent of cloves. Dark-skinned slaves from Africa, Indian merchants with colorful turbans, clever Genoese bankers, and of course, thousands of sailors whose faces were burned by the equatorial sun and weathered by the salty winds of the Atlantic walked along its cobblestone streets. And in the halls of the royal palace, where the young Magellan served, people only talked about new discoveries, new maps, and new routes to the riches of the East. Bartholomew Diaz had already rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that Africa could be navigated around. Vasco da Gama had just returned from his legendary journey that changed the world, establishing a direct sea route to India. All of Portugal was drunk on the anticipation of untold wealth and limitless imperial greatness. The young page, although performing routine courtly duties, eagerly absorbed this atmosphere. His education now included not only court etiquette, fencing, and horseback riding. The main sciences here were those that served expansion: astronomy, navigation, and map-making. He saw the secret: constantly updated maps brought back from expeditions. He listened to the captain's stories about storms of incredible force, strange people worshipping unknown gods, and exotic lands where spices grew right on the trees. The thirst for adventure and glory, typical of any young nobleman, merged in him with a pragmatic and sober understanding. The future of Portugal, and therefore his personal future, was out there, far away in the east. At the age of 25, in 1505, Magellan finally got his chance. He was no longer a page, but a grown man, eager to prove his worth. He enlisted in the military service and left for India as part of the huge and magnificently equipped fleet of Francisco de Almeida, who was appointed the first viceroy of Portuguese India. It was not a peaceful exploration expedition, it was an act of war. Its goal was to forcefully establish Portugal's total dominance in the Indian Ocean, building forts on key coasts, crushing the resistance of local rulers, and ruthlessly wiping out rival Arab, Turkish, and Egyptian merchants. For Magellan, 7 long and hard years began that would transform him from a young courtier into a hardened and ruthless veteran. He was not a captain, but a simple extra soldier, a volunteer. He took part in dozens of naval skirmishes, boardings, and land battles. In 1506, in the brutal Battle of Cannanore, he received his first serious wound. Later, in 1509, he participated in the grand and decisive naval Battle of Diu, where the small but technologically superior Portuguese fleet annihilated the combined fleet of the Egyptian Sultanate and its Indian allies. Once again, he proved to be a brave and calm warrior. He learned not only how to fight, but how to survive in an atmosphere of constant plotting that boiled among the Portuguese officers, who fought over loot, positions, and the favour of their superiors. He took part in the cruel conquest of Goa, under the command of the new and even more energetic and ruthless governor, Afonso de Albuquerque. But the key moment for his future, the turning point, was the expedition to Malacca in 1511. Malacca, located on the strategically important Malay Peninsula, was the gateway to the Far East. It was an incredibly rich and cosmopolitan trading city where the sea routes of India, Siam, China, and most importantly, the distant and almost mythical Spice Islands, the Moluccas, all came together. The assault on Malacca was hard and bloody. During one of the fierce street fights, Magellan was severely wounded in the leg by a spear. This wound, according to the historians of the time, would leave him with a slight limp for the rest of his life. For the bravery he showed in this campaign, he received a small share of the massive loot and another promotion. But the main thing was not that. It was here, in Malacca, where for the first time he obtained concrete and real information about the Moluccas, the birthplace of cloves and nutmeg, spices that in Europe were literally worth their weight in gold. It is possible that he even participated in one of the first Portuguese scouting expeditions that reached these islands. He saw it with his own eyes. He understood that whoever controlled this small archipelago lost in the ocean essentially controlled the most profitable trade in the world. It was then, studying maps, talking to local pilots, and comparing facts that a bold, almost heretical plan for a Portuguese man definitively formed in his mind. Everyone knew that the Portuguese had reached the east by sailing east, going around Africa through a route they kept in the strictest secret. But Magellan, who had studied the works of ancient geographers and listened to the stories of Columbus's voyages, knew that the Earth was a sphere, and this meant that the Spice Islands, which are located in the Far East, could be reached by sailing in the opposite direction, towards the west, across the ocean discovered by Columbus. It was only necessary to find that mythical strait, the passage, which many mapmakers believed should connect the Atlantic Ocean with the South Sea, somewhere south of the newly discovered American continent. After 7 years spent in battles, storms, and campaigns in the east, Magellan returned to Portugal in 1512. He was no longer the naive young page. He was a hardened veteran of 32 years, an experienced sailor and warrior who knew the East not from rumours, but from the scars on his body. He presented himself at the court of King Manuel I with a request for a salary increase, and much more importantly, with his grandiose and revolutionary project. But a cold, humiliating, and almost dismissive reception awaited him. Upon returning to Lisbon, Magellan expected recognition. 7 years of loyal and bloody service at the end of the world, participation in the greatest victories of the Portuguese military, wounds, experience, unique knowledge about the East. All of this, he believed, gave him the right to respect and a worthy reward. He was a veteran, a hero of Malacca. But in the court of King Manuel I, they saw him differently. He was just one among thousands, a minor noble without influential protectors who had simply done his duty. He presented an official petition to the king. He asked for two things: a small increase in his noble stipend, and much more importantly, an appointment to any captain's position in the new fleet leaving for the east. It was not a simple request for money. It was a request for status, for recognition of his merits. The king's answer was a cold and humiliating rejection. Manuel I was a suspicious, arrogant man, and he did not like those who, in his opinion, thought too highly of themselves. He saw nothing special in Magellan. Perhaps some rumors or complaints had reached him about Ferdinand's independent character, about his arguments with his superiors during his service in India. Whatever the case, the audience was short and led to nothing. Offended but not broken, Magellan tried to find another use for his talents. In 1513, he enlisted in the army and left for Morocco, where the Portuguese were fighting a constant, low-intensity war against the Moors. There, during a raid under the walls of the fortress of Azamor, he was once again severely wounded in the knee by a spear. This wound would leave him with a limp for life. After this injury, his military career practically ended. He was assigned a routine but responsible position, guarding and distributing the livestock captured as loot, and here he became involved in another unpleasant incident. He was accused of secretly selling some of the captured sheep and keeping the money. Magellan flew into a rage. He was sure it was a plot by his enemies. To prove his innocence, he left his post without permission and headed to Lisbon to present himself personally before the king. This act of insubordination infuriated Manuel I. The king did not even listen to his excuses. He sent him back to Morocco in disgrace, ordering him to face a trial. The investigation finally cleared Magellan of all charges, but his reputation in the court was ruined forever. He was an unreliable, disobedient, and difficult officer. When he finally retired from service and presented himself before the king again to ask one last time for a decent appointment, Manuel I denied him again with icy contempt. And then Magellan, driven to despair, asked the king a bold question. Would His Majesty allow him, Ferdinand Magellan, to seek service and sponsorship under another ruler? The king, according to the chronicle, made a dismissive gesture with his hand, saying that he did not care. For Magellan, it was the end. His homeland, to which he had given the best years of his life, and for which he had shed his blood, had completely rejected him. Resentment burned in his soul, a thirst for revenge, and above all, an unshakable confidence in his reasoning and the brilliance of his plan. In 1517, in secret to avoid drawing the attention of the Portuguese Secret Service, Ferdinand Magellan left Portugal. He headed to Spain, to Seville, the main port and overseas trade centre of Portugal's greatest enemy and competitor. In Seville, he was not alone. There he found support among other Portuguese immigrants and, most importantly, joined forces with another exile, the prominent cosmographer and astronomer Rui Falero. Together they perfected their plan, backing it up with complex astronomical calculations, maps, and legal arguments. The core of their project was brilliant in its boldness. According to the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494, the world had been divided between Spain and Portugal by a meridian. All lands to the east of it belonged to Portugal, and to the west, to Spain. The Portuguese, going around Africa, had reached India and the Spice Islands from the east. Magellan, on the other hand, proposed reaching those same islands by sailing west across the Atlantic and through the mythical strait in the New World. And he, along with Falero, was ready to prove, with maps and calculations, that the Moluccas, seen from the west, were in the Spanish hemisphere of influence. This meant that Spain could access the richest spice trade in the world without technically violating the treaty. Through influential contacts, Magellan secured an audience with the young 17-year-old Spanish king, King Charles I, the future Emperor Charles V. In March 1518, Magellan and Falero presented themselves before the king and his council. Magellan spoke calmly, confidently, without excessive emotion. He did not look like a dreamer. He looked like a practical man, a veteran who knew what he was talking about. He unrolled the maps before the king. He showed the calculations. He referred to secret Portuguese reports he had seen. He spoke of the strait, the passage, not as a theory, but as an almost proven fact. And he swore that he would lead the Spanish ships to the Spice Islands and return triumphant. The young King Charles, unlike the tired Portuguese monarch, was full of ambition. He saw in this project an incredible opportunity to rub it in the face of his uncle and rival, the King of Portugal, and to obtain a source of untold wealth for his treasury. After brief discussions, he gave his consent. On the 22nd of March, 1518, the official agreement was signed. Ferdinand Magellan, the exile and disgraced officer of yesterday, was named Captain General of the Spanish fleet. He was granted the titles of Governor and Commander of all the lands he discovered. He was promised 1/20th of all the income from the expedition. It was a total and unconditional victory. Magellan got everything his homeland had denied him. He got ships, money, men, and most importantly, the faith of a monarch in his dream. Now all he had to do was turn that dream into reality, equipping a fleet and embarking on the most dangerous and grandiose journey in human history. And behind him forever remained the country to which he had given his youth, and which so lightly had rejected its future great hero. After signing the triumphant, almost incredible agreement in Valladolid, Ferdinand Magellan returned to Seville, invested with an authority that few foreigners could claim in the Spanish court. Now he was not acting as a beggar, but on behalf of King Charles I himself. He held a royal mandate to equip an expedition to the distant Spice Islands, an expedition that was to be carried out going west through unexplored seas, avoiding all the territories assigned to his former homeland, Portugal. But between the royal decree on parchment and the tight sails ready to catch the wind, there opened an abyss filled with dense bureaucracy, toxic courtly plots, open sabotage, and a silent, almost physical human hostility. The next 18 months, from the spring of 1518 to the summer of 1519, became a real and exhausting battle for Magellan, but a battle fought not at sea, but on land. In the dusty offices of officials, in noisy taverns, in the shipyards and warehouses of Seville, he had to build a fleet from scratch, buy supplies for a 2-year journey for hundreds of men, recruit a crew willing to embark on a journey from which most likely no one would return, secure funding while fighting off treasurers, and above all, keep control of the project, which from the start faced fierce resistance from all sides. The first and most dangerous blow came from the Portuguese side. The agents of King Manuel I in Spain, upon hearing of the traitor Magellan's project, did everything possible to sabotage the expedition. They bribed suppliers to deliver rotten ropes and wormy biscuits. They sabotaged the repair of the ships. They spread a rumor through all the port taverns that Magellan was a Portuguese spy who, in reality, wanted to lead the Spanish fleet into a trap and destroy it. No less was the resistance from the Spanish bureaucracy itself. The House of Trade in Seville, which controlled all expeditions to the New World, viewed with open hostility that such a massive and promising project with enormous benefits was led by a foreigner, a Portuguese man. The officials deliberately delayed funding, supplied poor quality materials, and most importantly, forced their own men into key positions to watch Magellan's every move. Despite all these obstacles, Magellan, showing incredible, almost superhuman perseverance, put his mismatched little fleet together step by step. He was assigned 5 ships. They were not new caravels, specially built for ocean crossings. They were old merchant ships, used vessels, that had to be repaired, reinforced, and slowly and painfully adapted for a journey into the unknown. Trinidad, the flagship, a relatively solid and heavily armed ship of 110 tons that Magellan chose for himself after a long inspection. San Antonio, the largest and most spacious ship of the fleet, at 120 tons, meant to carry most of the supplies, a true floating pantry. Concepcion, at 90 tons, and Victoria, at 85 tons, 2 smaller vessels, the workhorses of the fleet. The destiny of the Victoria, a sturdy and reliable ship, would become unique. And finally, Santiago, the smallest and lightest ship, at only 75 tons, ideal for exploring shallow and unknown bays and rivers. Magellan personally spent his time at the shipyards from morning until late at night. Limping, he walked through his ships, inspecting every plank of the hull, every barrel, every rope. He, better than anyone, understood that in the infinite ocean, thousands of miles from the nearest land, any small thing, any rotten rope, any cracked mast, or leaking fresh water barrel could cause the doom of the whole expedition. At the same time, the purchase of provisions was taking place. The numbers are staggering. More than 21,000 pounds of hardtack were bought. A huge amount of salted meat, dried fish, beans, lentils, rice, cheese, honey, and raisins. And of course, wine, the main stress reliever and calorie source for the sailors. But besides the food, thousands of other equally important items were purchased. Spare sails, anchors, tons of rope, tools for carpenters and blacksmiths, weapons, cannons, arquebuses, crossbows, gunpowder, lead bullets, and, of course, whole chests of goods to trade with, the supposed natives, cheap mirrors, knives, axes, copper bells, and rolls of bright red cloth. The most difficult, almost impossible task was recruiting the crew. Spanish sailors, especially the proud Andalusians, were not eager to sail into the unknown under the command of a Portuguese man. They had to recruit, as they say, the riffraff from all over Europe. In the end, the crew of about 240 men was made up of Spaniards, Portuguese, exiles like Magellan, Italians, Frenchmen, Germans, Greeks, and even an Englishman. Among them were seasoned sea dogs, as well as young cabin boys going to sea for the first time, and even criminals who had been promised a royal pardon in exchange for taking part in this deadly expedition. But the main ticking time bomb placed under the whole expedition was the appointment of aristocratic Spanish captains for the other 4 ships. These men, tied to the hostile House of Trade, saw Magellan from the start not as an admiral, but as an upstart and an enemy. Juan de Cartagena, captain of the San Antonio, was not a simple captain, but the official royal overseer, and he behaved with defiant arrogance, almost openly questioning Magellan's orders in meetings. Gaspar de Quesada, captain of the Concepcion, and Luis de Mendoza, captain of the Victoria, fully supported him. This conspiracy was already brewing on land, in the hot taverns of Seville. They had agreed to put up with the Portuguese man for a while, but at the first opportunity, they would take command into their own hands. Magellan saw it and understood it all perfectly. He was alone against everyone. Even his old friend and scientific partner, the brilliant but mentally unstable cosmographer Rui Falero, who was supposed to be second in command, was removed from the expedition at the last minute due to bouts of madness. Magellan was left in absolute, chilling isolation. Finally, in August 1519, the fleet was ready. The 5 small ships, overloaded, smelling of tar and salted meat, slowly sailed down the Guadalquivir River to its mouth, to the port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda. There they stayed for over a month, waiting for favorable winds and passing the last humiliating inspections from the officials. It was here, before sailing into the open and endless ocean, that Magellan made his last move on this coastal chessboard. He wrote and issued a detailed and strict set of rules and signals for the fleet. Every action, every turn, every maneuver was specified. At night, all ships had to relentlessly follow a special lantern on the stern of his flagship, Trinidad. He established an iron, almost military discipline and made it clear to his arrogant captains that all arguments and plotting were over. At sea, there was only one law, his order. On the morning of the 20th of September 1519, to the sound of church bells and the crying of the women saying goodbye on the shore, the 5 small and battered ships, one after another, raised their anchors and sailed into the Atlantic Ocean. Ahead of them lay the totally and absolutely unknown, and on board, besides hundreds of desperate men, sailed hatred, envy, and a mutiny already ripe, ready to explode at any moment. The greatest journey in human history began with a betrayal. When the 5 ships, under the command of Ferdinand Magellan, left Sanlúcar de Barrameda and sailed into the vast Atlantic, none of those on deck, watching the Spanish land fade into the mist, could imagine that their journey would last almost 3 years. No one knew that only one of those 5 ships and a handful of exhausted men would be destined to return home, completing the circle around the globe. The first few weeks went by with surprising normality. Favorable winds filled the sails. The fleet stayed in a tight formation, following the signals from the flagship, Trinidad. The sailors, not yet tired of the crowding in the holds, the boring food of hardtack and salted meat, and the constant rocking, kept their spirits up. The ship sailed south along the coast of Africa, toward the Canary Islands, and then turned southwest, crossing the Atlantic. But the tension between Magellan and the Spanish captains began to show almost immediately. Juan de Cartagena, captain of the largest ship, San Antonio, openly challenged authority. According to established naval custom, every evening the captains of the other ships had to approach the flagship to say goodnight to the admiral and receive their orders for the next day. Cartagena began to do this with defiant disrespect. Magellan tolerated it. But when one day Cartagena, in response to a warning, publicly stated that he had received instructions from the king and not from a simple Portuguese man, Magellan's patience ran out. He called the captains to his ship, and there, during a heated argument, he personally grabbed Cartagena by the collar and declared him under arrest for disobeying orders. Command of the San Antonio was given to another officer. It was a bold move that showed everyone that Magellan would not tolerate a mutiny. But this only made the conspiracy dig in deeper. In early December, the expedition reached the coast of South America, entering the beautiful bay that would later be called Rio de Janeiro. Here, Magellan allowed the crew a 2-week stop. For the sailors, exhausted by the long journey, it was a real paradise. The ships anchored in calm waters, and the crews had the chance to rest on land, make minor repairs, refill their fresh water supplies, and most importantly, eat plenty of fresh food. Trade with the natives was very lively. Knives, mirrors, cloth, and copper bells were traded for pineapples, sweet potatoes, wild boar meat, and fresh fish. After the rest, the fleet continued its journey south, along an unknown coast. In January 1520, they explored the huge mouth of the Rio de la Plata, hoping it would be the long-sought strait. But it soon became clear that it was just a giant river mouth. The disappointment was huge. They sailed further and further south. The coast became more and more unwelcoming, deserted, and hostile. The days grew shorter, and the nights colder. The autumn of the southern hemisphere was beginning. The winds grew stronger, turning into freezing storms. By late March, realizing that to keep going in such conditions was suicide, Magellan decided to stop for the winter. He found a deep, well-protected bay, which he named Port St. Julian. The decision was the only right one, but it became the spark that lit the powder keg of mutiny. The crew was desperate. The cold, the inactivity, the reduced rations, the lack of fresh food, and above all, the complete uncertainty about the future. Many were convinced that there was no strait, and that the Portuguese admiral was leading them to certain death, and the Spanish captains decided their time had come. On the night of the 1st of April, Palm Sunday, an open mutiny broke out. The conspirators acted quickly and with coordination. Gaspar de Quesada, captain of the Concepcion, with a group of armed officers, secretly boarded the San Antonio and took it over, arresting the captain loyal to Magellan. At the same time, Luis de Mendoza on the Victoria also rebelled. At dawn, Magellan found himself in a disastrous situation. Out of the 5 ships in the fleet, 3, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, and the Victoria, were in the hands of the mutineers. Under his control remained only his flagship, Trinidad, and the small scout ship, Santiago. The mutineers sent him a boat with a letter demanding that he recognize their authority and accept their terms. Magellan faced a choice: give up and lose everything, or take a desperate and deadly risk. He chose the latter. He kept the boat with the mutineers' messengers and organized a special, fast, and bold operation. He sent his trusted officer, Gonzalo Gomez de Espinosa, with several unarmed sailors to the Victoria, supposedly to negotiate, but behind them, hidden from view, followed a second boat with his best men, heavily armed. When Espinosa boarded the Victoria and handed Captain Mendoza a letter from Magellan, the captain laughed with contempt upon reading it. At that exact moment, Espinosa pulled out a dagger and struck Mendoza a deadly blow. At the same time, Magellan's armed men stormed the deck. The crew of the Victoria, deprived of their leader and taken by surprise, surrendered without a fight. This was the turning point. By capturing the Victoria, Magellan evened the odds. Now he had 3 ships against 2. He ordered his 3 ships to block the exit from the bay. The remaining mutineers, Quesada and Cartagena, realizing they were trapped, tried to escape during the night. But the San Antonio ran aground, and its crew, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, also surrendered. The Concepcion was the last to be captured. By dawn, the mutiny was completely crushed. Magellan set up a military court on the shore. The punishment was swift and brutal, as the rules of war demanded. The body of the murdered Mendoza was drawn and quartered. Captain Gaspar de Quesada was found guilty of treason and beheaded. As for the main instigator, Juan de Cartagena, Magellan, not daring to execute a man with such strong connections at court, sentenced him to the most terrible fate. When, a few months later, the fleet left that bay, Cartagena, along with another plotting priest, would simply be left behind on the desolate and freezing coast, without food and without hope of rescue. Their ultimate fate is unknown. After putting down the mutiny, Magellan restored strict order in the fleet. No one else dared to question his authority, but the price of victory was high. Shortly after these events, the scout ship Santiago was caught in a storm and crashed into the rocks. Fortunately, almost the entire crew was saved. Having lost 1 ship and survived treason and mutiny, Magellan spent 5 agonizing months in that frozen bay. He waited. He waited for the winter to end, for the storms to calm down. He didn't know where the strait was. He didn't know if it even existed. But when spring arrived, he gave the order that everyone expected, with a mix of fear and hope. Prepare the fleet to sail. At the end of October, the ships raised their anchors, and the expedition headed south again, toward an unknown and foggy coast, where, he believed, the path to another, the great ocean, lay open. When at the end of October 1520, the 4 remaining ships under Magellan's command left the cold bay of St. Julian and headed south again, the spring of the southern hemisphere was beginning. But these lands knew no real spring. They continued to greet the travelers with freezing, biting winds, sleet, and a piercing, sharp dampness. 1 ship had previously been lost during a scouting mission, and the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the flagship, the Trinidad, moved with difficulty along a steep, gloomy, and monotonous coast that seemed to have no end. A quiet tension was growing again among the officers and sailors. More than a year had passed since they sailed from Spain. The supplies were running low quickly, and the promised strait connecting the 2 oceans had still not been found. Every new bay, every inlet, sparked a shy hope and always ended in bitter disappointment, turning out to be just another dead end. On the 21st of October, the day of St. Ursula and the 11,000 virgins, the ships approached a stretch of the coast where a high rocky cape, which Magellan called the Cape of the Virgins, formed a narrow and dark entrance to a deep bay that reached into the west. From the top of the mast, which a pilot once again climbed, a distant curve of water could be seen disappearing somewhere inland. Magellan, after a brief and tense meeting with his officers, ordered them to enter. Intuitively, almost mystically, he believed that this could be the long-sought passage. What at first seemed like a deep, ordinary bay soon turned into an endless, winding, maze-like corridor. It was a gloomy, almost otherworldly realm. On both sides rose steep, rocky slopes, crowned by glaciers. The stone cliffs cast long, cold shadows over the grey, almost black water, and the wind, sweeping down from the snowy peaks, brought violent and unpredictable gusts that tore the sails and made it hard to steer the ships. Despite the deadly danger, the fleet moved forward slowly, feeling its way. The strait sometimes narrowed down to just a few hundred yards, trapping the ships in a stone vice, only to widen again, forming actual inland lakes. Between the curves, side bays, dark fjords, countless branches, and small islands constantly appeared. It was completely impossible to know which was the main route and which was another dead end, from which they might not be able to get out. The travelers had to stop constantly, lower the boats to measure the depths, and look for a safe channel. Several times, the ships were forced to split up. Magellan sent the San Antonio and the Concepcion to explore one of the southern channels, while he, with the Trinidad and the Victoria, stayed in the main waterway, waiting for their return. And in this heavy and tense atmosphere, one of the most serious and fatal episodes of the entire expedition happened: the desertion of the San Antonio. The ship, after the mutiny was crushed, was officially commanded by a relative of Magellan, but the real power on board was held by the pilot Esteban Gomez. Gomez, an experienced Portuguese sailor, had initially been one of the main supporters of the expedition, but now, exhausted by the hardships and convinced that the strait did not exist, decided he had had enough. He saw Magellan as a madman, leading them all to certain death. Taking advantage of a moment when the other ships were temporarily out of sight due to the fog and the curves of the strait, Gomez led a mutiny on board. He and a group of his supporters arrested the captain, wounded several officers loyal to Magellan, and took control of the ship. The San Antonio, the largest ship in the fleet, carrying most of the remaining supplies, turned around, left the strait, and sailed into the open ocean, setting a course back to Spain. It wasn't just an escape. It was a monstrous betrayal that endangered not only the survival of the rest of the fleet, but the entire political backing of the project. Because, upon returning to Spain, the mutineers could say anything. That Magellan had gone crazy, that he was a tyrant, that he had deliberately led the men to their doom. Magellan only learned of the desertion several days later, when the San Antonio did not show up at the agreed meeting point. He waited a long time, sent signals, but to no avail. He understood that he had been betrayed. He didn't start a search, knowing it was useless. The situation demanded they keep moving forward. The three remaining ships, the Trinidad, the Concepcion, and the Victoria, continued their agonizing journey through the winding and treacherous waterway. The crossing of the strait, which would later be named after Magellan, took a total of 38 days. The men worked to the very limit of their physical and moral strength. They constantly adjusted the sails against a gusty crosswind. They climbed the freezing, slippery shores to scout, constantly watched out for rocks, and drew maps of the passage. The width of the strait varied from 1.2 to 3.1 miles, and its length was almost 370 miles. The depths were uneven, and the current was strong and unpredictable, changing direction with the tides. Sometimes, the water rose sharply, and the ships were forced to wait in small protected bays. On other days, thick, cold fogs hid the way, and only the incredible experience of the pilots prevented crashes into underwater reefs. At night, on the southern shore, which they called Tierra del Fuego, they saw strange lights. They were the fires of the local natives, but they barely saw any people. This bleak, empty, and cold landscape had a depressing effect on the mind. Exhaustion grew among the sailors. Many began to suffer from fevers caused by the constant dampness and cold, frostbite, weakness, fights in the lower decks, and hidden bouts of panic became more and more common. Magellan, contrary to the legends about his harshness and distance, acted like a true leader during those days. He constantly checked the ships, personally took part in meetings, gave instructions to the navigators, and encouraged the officers. He understood that if the men broke now, halfway through the strait, everything would be lost. And then, at the end of November, finally, another sea opened up ahead. On the 28th of November, 1520, the three ships passed the last rocky point, and beyond lay the horizon, flat, endless, calm, without storms or gales. The sailors, used in the last few weeks to fierce winds, frozen ropes, and frantic rocking, felt a steady tailwind for the first time in a long time, and saw blue, smooth, and stable water. It was another ocean. Magellan, standing on the back of his flagship, the Trinidad, stayed silent for a long time, looking at that blue and peaceful vastness. Only after a while did he speak its name: Pacific Ocean. Not because it was calm by nature, but because after mutinies, shipwrecks, and betrayals, just the thought of calmness seemed like a true miracle. None of them knew that ahead of them lay not weeks, as they naively believed, but the longest and most agonizing months of sailing of their lives. But at that moment, the victory was complete, absolute. The strait had been found, crossed, and mapped forever. Beyond began the great ocean. When the three remaining ships, the Trinidad, the Concepcion, and the Victoria, left the cold maze of the Strait of Magellan and entered the boundless waters of a new and unknown ocean, a feeling of joy filled the air on board. The worst, they thought, was over. They had found and crossed the legendary strait. Now, according to their calculations, based on the inaccurate maps of the time, only a few weeks of travel remained to the rich Spice Islands. The waters of the new ocean turned out to be surprisingly calm. There were no hurricanes, no squalls, nor the high waves they were used to in the Atlantic. The wind blew steadily and favorably. The course was held firm. Magellan named this ocean the Pacific, and at first, the name seemed totally justified. But that calm was misleading. It was the calm of a desert. A week passed, then another. The ship stubbornly sailed northwest, but there was nothing on the horizon. Not a cloud, not a shadow of land, not even birds. The ocean was endless, empty, and absolutely lifeless. A month passed. The calculations turned out to be disastrously wrong. The geographers of the past, on whose works the mapmakers of the time relied, could not even imagine the true size of this giant body of water. The Pacific Ocean turned out to be several times larger than they had guessed. And then the hunger began. Slow, painful, consuming. The supplies, calculated for a short crossing, began to run out, especially after the traitorous desertion of the San Antonio, which carried most of the food. The first things to go were the fresh products, then the wine, then the cheese and dried meat. The main food became hardtack, but it was no longer hardtack. After months at sea, it had turned into a disgusting powder, crawling with worms, mixed with rat droppings, and soaked in the damp smell of the cargo hold. The water in the barrels had gone bad. It became yellow, thick, and foul-smelling. They had to drink it while holding their noses. When even those biscuits ran out, the real hell began. The men ate anything that could even slightly fill their stomachs. According to Antonio Pigafetta, the writer of the expedition, they started eating sawdust. They tore the ox leather used to wrap the rigging from the masts and yards to protect it from rubbing. This leather, hard as a rock, they first soaked for several days in seawater to soften it, and then they roasted it over coals and tried to chew it. They ate the ship's rats, which were now considered a delicacy, and sold for half a ducat each. And along with hunger, it arrived. The disease most feared by sailors, scurvy. Because of the lack of vitamin C, their gums swelled and bled so much that a person could not even chew the leather straps. Their teeth became loose and fell out. Their bodies became covered in sores. Their joints swelled, causing unbearable pain. The men weakened right before everyone's eyes, turning into living skeletons. They couldn't stand up. They couldn't do the simplest tasks. They just lay on the deck, in dirt and despair, dying slowly. Every day, into the calm and uncaring waters of the Pacific Ocean, 2 or 3 bodies were thrown, hastily sewn into an old piece of canvas. The crews were shrinking. On some ships, there were so few healthy sailors left that they barely had enough to handle the sails and stay on course. Officers, pilots, carpenters, anyone who could still stand, stood watch alongside the regular sailors. And all this happened in an absolute and crushing silence. There were no storms, no thunder, no sounds of the coast to distract from this slow agony. Only the dull creaking of the masts, the splashing of water against the hull, the weak groans of the sick, and the rare, hoarse orders from the officers. It was the torture of emptiness. During this whole endless crossing of almost 100 days, they only saw 2 small islands, empty and barren, which Magellan, with bitterness, called the Unfortunate Islands. They were surrounded by sharp reefs, and it was impossible to land on them to restock supplies. Magellan, like everyone else, suffered from hunger and hardship, but he held on. He continued to do his duties as a commander, checking the course, walking the decks, talking to the pilots, trying to give the survivors even a shadow of hope. In public, he showed neither fear nor doubt. Although, as Pigafetta later wrote, even in the admiral's eyes, usually as hard as steel, traces of despair appeared. Finally, in early March, 1521, after 98 days of this hell, a sailor from the top of the mast shouted with a rough voice that didn't sound like his own, "Land!" At first, no one believed it. It seemed like another trick of the eye, an illusion right before death. But an hour later, the shape of a tall, green island became visible to everyone. People cried, laughed, prayed, and fell to their knees. It was salvation. It was the island of Guam, one of the Mariana Islands. Landing was like madness. People rushed to the fresh water springs, drinking until they fell onto the sand. They chopped down coconut trees, greedily eating the sweet fruit. They dug up edible roots. In a few days, the crew regained more strength than in the past 3 months. But not everyone survived. Several people died right on the beach. Their exhausted bodies couldn't handle the sudden change from starvation to plenty of food. The island turned out to be inhabited, and although the first meeting with the natives, the Chamorro people, was filled with misunderstandings and even an armed fight over the theft of one of the boats, for which Magellan took cruel revenge, burning down a village and killing several people. It didn't turn into a major war. The main things the expedition needed, water, food, and rest, they got. Behind them lay the greatest and most terrible sea voyage in human history. The Pacific Ocean had been crossed, but Magellan didn't yet know that he had not reached the Spice Islands, but the Philippines, and that it would be right here, in this paradise that looked so much like salvation, where not triumph, but death awaited him. After the brutal crossing of the Pacific and a short healing stop on the island of Guam, the 3 remaining ships under the command of Ferdinand Magellan continued westward. In mid-March 1521, the fleet reached a large unknown group of islands, which would later be called the Philippines. Here, on one of the islands, something happened that confirmed to Magellan that he was close to his goal. His slave and translator, Enrique of Malacca, whom he had bought before the journey, suddenly realized he could talk to the locals. Their languages were similar. This meant they had returned to the world they once left. The circle was almost closed. Magellan, using Enrique as a diplomat, began to make contact with the local chiefs. On the island of Limasawa, he made an alliance with Raja Kalambu, but his main goal was the island of Cebu, a large, rich, and politically important trading center. There ruled Raja Humabon. It was at this moment when Magellan's strategy changed. He was no longer acting simply as an explorer or a merchant. He was acting as a missionary, as a carrier of the supreme faith. Instead of just trading, he began to preach Christianity. He showed Raja Humabon the power of his weapons, cannons, and arquebuses. But he didn't talk of conquering, rather of an alliance under the flag of the King of Spain and the Christian God. Humabon, a practical man, seeing the technological superiority of the Europeans and wanting to strengthen his power over neighboring chiefs, accepted. On the 14th of April, a grand ceremony took place. Raja Humabon, his wife, and about 800 of his subjects were baptized. Magellan seemed to have reached the peak of his success. Not only had he found new lands, he had brought the true faith to them. He felt like a holy messenger. But it was exactly this triumph that caused his doom. One of the chiefs of the small neighboring island of Mactan, named Lapu-Lapu, refused to bow to both Humabon and the white gods. He was one of the few who saw the Spaniards not as gods, but as heavily armed men. Raja Humabon, wanting to test his new allies, complained to Magellan about the rebel, and Magellan made his fatal mistake. Drunk on his successes, believing he could not be harmed, he decided to personally punish the rebellious chief with a small group of men. He turned down Humabon's help, proudly claiming that his 49 soldiers in steel armor would be enough to scatter a crowd of savages. On the 27th of April, 1521, at dawn, Magellan's squad approached the shore of Mactan. But they didn't account for one thing: the low tide. The ships couldn't get close to the shore because of the coral reefs, and their cannons were useless. The Spaniards had to wade towards the beach, in water up to their waists, under a rain of arrows and spears. Waiting for them on the beach were, according to various estimates, more than 1,000 of Lapu-Lapu's warriors. The fight was short and terrible. The Spaniards, slowed down by their heavy armor in the water, broke their formation. Magellan, who was fighting in the front line, was wounded in the leg by a poisoned arrow. Then, they pierced his arm with a spear. He fell, and at that moment, the natives rushed him from all sides. He died fighting, on a strange beach, in muddy waters, thousands of miles from his home. His body was never recovered. Lapu-Lapu refused to hand it over, even for a large ransom. The death of Magellan was a disaster for the expedition. They hadn't just lost their commander, but their brains, their will, their lucky charm. Chaos broke out. Raja Humabon, seeing that his unbeatable allies had been defeated, betrayed them immediately. During a make-up feast he hosted, he deceitfully murdered another 30 Spaniards, including the new commanders. The remains of the expedition fled Cebu in a panic. There were so few left that there weren't enough men to crew the 3 ships. The Concepcion had to be burned. The 2 remaining ships, the Trinidad and the Victoria, wandered the islands for several months, turning to piracy and trading, until they finally reached their original goal, the Moluccas. There they loaded their holds with the precious cloves. They faced the question, how to return. It was decided they would split up. The Trinidad would try to go back the way they came, across the Pacific, and the Victoria, under the command of the new captain, the Basque Juan Sebastian Elcano, would take the desperate and suicidal step of trying to return home, heading west, across the Indian Ocean, which was crawling with hostile Portuguese ships. The fate of the Trinidad was tragic. After several tries, she was captured by the Portuguese. Almost her entire crew died in captivity. But the Victoria, achieved the impossible. Elcano, a brilliant and careful sailor, guided his worn-out, leaking ship across the entire Indian Ocean, trying to stay away from all known routes. It was another hellish journey. Again hunger, again scurvy, again death. Out of the 47 Europeans who left the Moluccas, only 18 reached Spain. On the 6th of September 1522, almost exactly 3 years after the start of the expedition, the Victoria slowly entered the port of Seville, almost like a ghost. The exhausted men, looking like skeletons, who stepped onto the shore, could barely stand. They were the first human beings in history to travel around the world. Their cargo, 26 tons of cloves, more than covered all the costs of the expedition. But their greatest achievement was not spices. They brought back knowledge. They proved that the earth is a sphere, that all oceans are connected, that the world is one. Thus ended the greatest journey in history. A journey started under the Spanish flag, led by a stubborn Portuguese man and completed by a brave Basque. Ferdinand Magellan did not return home. But his dream, his crazy and obsessive idea, brought to reality at the cost of hundreds of lives, forever changed the conception that humanity had of its own home. If you enjoyed this incredible journey into history, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment below with your thoughts.